It is difficult to overstate the profound symbolism of the Third Servile War, led by Spartacus. Not merely a historical revolt, it became a powerful metaphor for the universal struggle for freedom against oppression. While the Roman Republic would ultimately crush the rebellion, the ideals that Spartacus and his followers fought for would echo through the corridors of time. Spartacus's rebellion was the last and by far the most impactful of the Servile War's three major slave uprisings that rattled the Roman world. The first two had occurred in Sicily and had already demonstrated how dangerous a large population of oppressed people could be. But unlike the earlier uprisings, the Third Servile War struck at the very heart of the Republic. It was no longer a distant problem confined to provincial estates. It had come to Italy itself. At the center of this revolt stood a man who was as enigmatic as he was formidable. Spartacus, a Thracian by origin, had once served in the Roman army, possibly as an auxiliary or even a mercenary. His reasons for being enslaved remain unclear, but he ended up in one of the most brutal institutions of the Republic, a gladiator school, or ludus, in Capua. These schools were less centers of training than they were violent pressure cookers, where men were groomed to fight to the death for Roman entertainment. Unsurprisingly, rebellion simmered just beneath the surface. In 73 BCE, that simmer reached a boiling point. About 200 gladiators plotted their escape from the school of Lentulus Batiatus, a particularly cruel master. The plan was discovered, but 70 of them still managed to break free, arming themselves with kitchen knives, cleavers, and anything else they could get their hands on. From the very beginning, the rebellion was marked by desperation but also by ingenuity and fire. As they fought their way out, they seized gladiatorial weapons and armor. These were not standard military issue, but they were deadly, all the same, designed for spectacle and brutal combat. Spartacus was elected as leader, with two Gauls, Crixus and enigmas, as his lieutenants. In their first real engagement outside Capua, they managed to defeat a local force sent by Batiatus. This was no small feat. It demonstrated tactical awareness and a capacity for violence that Rome could no longer ignore. As word spread of their escape, enslaved people from all around the countryside began to flock to Spartacus's banner. It was not just a rebellion anymore, it was turning into a movement. The rebels needed a base, and they found it in the rugged terrain of Mount Vesuvius. Though best known today for the cataclysmic eruption that would one day bury Pompeii, at the time it offered a defensible location from which Spartacus could train and organize his growing force. From here, he began raiding the nearby countryside both to obtain supplies and to liberate more slaves. Rome, however, was still slow to react. The Senate, dismissing the uprising as little more than a band of escaped criminals, dispatched a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber with a force of about 3,000 hastily conscripted militia. These were not hardened legionaries, they were a ragtag militia, poorly trained and poorly led. Glaber opted not to engage the rebels directly. Instead, he tried to trap them on Vesuvius by blocking the only known path down. This was where Spartacus showed his brilliance as a military leader. Using vines and branches, his men constructed makeshift ropes and ladders, lowering themselves down the steep face of the mountain under the cover of darkness. Once at the base, they marched around and launched a surprise attack on Glaber's position, routing his force completely. The Roman arrogance of underestimating Spartacus had cost them dearly. With this victory, Spartacus's popularity grew exponentially. More slaves joined, more supplies were captured. Rome began to panic. The Senate now sent another force under the praetor Publius Varinius, but even this was poorly coordinated. Varinius split his army into several detachments, making them vulnerable. Spartacus took full advantage. His men first crushed the force under the legate Furius, then ambushed and annihilated another led by Causanius near a riverbank. The praetor himself barely escaped with his life. What had begun as a jailbreak was now full-scale war. By the end of 73 BC, Spartacus had an army of nearly 70,000 people, many of whom were not just men with nothing to lose, but former soldiers, miners, and craftsmen with skills critical to sustaining a rebel force. Spartacus showed a genius for leadership by distributing war spoils fairly, maintaining high morale, and ensuring discipline within the ranks. These were not just bands of looters, they were an army with purpose. They moved through southern Italy, sacking towns like Nola, Nuceria, and Thurii. The countryside became a battlefield, and the Republic was finally beginning to understand the scale of the threat. Spartacus wasn't merely trying to survive, he was making a statement. The conquered were fighting back, and they were winning. But with success came challenge. The movement, always somewhat loose in command, began to show fractures. Crixus, one of Spartacus's most loyal lieutenants, wanted to stay in the south and continue raiding. Spartacus, however, had grander ambitions. He sought to move north through Cisalpine Gaul, possibly with the aim of breaking through to freedom beyond the Alps. It was a bold strategy, one that revealed Spartacus's understanding of both geography and politics. The disagreement led to a split. Crixus took 30,000 men and remained in the south, while Spartacus led the rest, possibly up to 60,000 northward. Unfortunately, this division weakened and the rebellion's momentum. Crixus was caught and defeated by the consul Lucius Gellius Publicola at Mount Garganus. 20,000 rebels died, including Crixus himself. It was a tragic loss and marked the first major setback in what had otherwise been a string of spectacular successes. Spartacus, meanwhile, faced a double threat. While moving north, he encountered the second consul, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, blocking the road. Publicola, following his victory over Crixus, was racing north to trap Spartacus between the two consular armies. What followed was nothing short of military brilliance. Spartacus didn't hesitate. He attacked Clodianus first, overwhelming his forces with superior numbers and ferocity. Then, without giving Publicola time to react, he pivoted and smashed the second army as well. Both consuls were forced to retreat to Rome in disgrace. This double victory marked the height of Spartacus's power. His army now numbered as many as 120,000 people, including civilians. For a brief moment, Rome truly trembled. Some sources even suggest Spartacus considered marching on the city itself, but ultimately decided against it. Despite his numbers, his army lacked the engineering and siege capabilities required to take such a heavily fortified urban center. Instead, he turned south again, perhaps intending to use Sicily as a staging ground for further rebellion. He tried to negotiate passage with pirates, hoping to cross with part of his army. But the pirates betrayed him. Spartacus paid them, but they never returned. It was a critical moment. While Spartacus regrouped in Lucania and continued raiding for the winter, the Senate acted with desperation. They called upon a man of wealth, ambition, and ruthlessness, Marcus Licinius Crassus. The rise of Crassus and the turning tide. By the time 70 BCE ended, the Roman Senate was both humiliated and terrified. Their most decorated generals had been outmaneuvered by a former gladiator. Two consular armies had been defeated. Entire regions of southern Italy were under the control of what was once dismissed as a band of escaped slaves. Rome needed not just a commander, they needed a savior. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was already one of the wealthiest men in Rome, possibly in the entire known world. His fortune, built on real estate speculation and political influence, gave him leverage few could match. Yet for all his wealth, Crassus desired glory, the kind of eternal fame that could not be purchased. A military victory against the most dangerous rebellion in Roman history would be just the ladder he needed to climb to the consulship and beyond. He volunteered himself to take up command. More than that, he pledged his personal wealth to fund the war effort. The Senate, desperate and with few alternatives, agreed and appointed him with proconsular imperium, essentially giving him near absolute military authority. Crassus inherited the remnants of Publicola and Clodianus's forces, demoralized and shaken. He added to them 6 fresh legions, bringing his total to around 30,000 to 50,000 troops, including auxiliaries. But Crassus understood that his greatest challenge wasn't Spartacus, it was restoring Roman discipline. The legions had failed repeatedly, not because they lacked numbers or weapons, but because they lacked backbone. Crassus knew that fear of Spartacus had eroded morale. His solution: make them fear him even more. In one of the most brutal disciplinary actions of Roman history, Crassus decimated the former consular legions. For those unfamiliar, decimation was an ancient and feared punishment. Soldiers were grouped into units of 10, drew lots, and the man who lost was beaten to death by the other 9. It was a punishment rarely used, but Crassus revived it with savage precision. Hundreds were killed, but the survivors were now bound by fear and discipline. This act was controversial, even within Rome, but Crassus didn't care. He wasn't looking to be popular, he was aiming to be victorious. Soon after, Crassus sent 2 legions under his subordinate, Mummius, to shadow Spartacus's movements, with strict instructions not to engage. But ambition, as always, proved dangerous. Mummius, hoping for personal glory, disobeyed and attacked. Spartacus, ever alert, crushed him swiftly. The legions fled. Again, Crassus was furious. He gathered the 500 men who had initiated the retreat and decimated them, as well this time in front of the entire army. It was a cold message. Failure would not be tolerated, and it worked. The Roman legions, now terrified of their own commander, began to function like the professional army they were meant to be. Crassus took personal control and began pushing Spartacus south. The rebel leader, now with an estimated 70,000 followers, realized the danger. Crassus was not like the others. This one was serious. Spartacus tried to break away and head toward Lucania, hoping to sail to Sicily with the aid of Cilician pirates. His plan was ambitious: spark another slave uprising on the island and use it as a base for continued resistance. But once again, betrayal struck. Despite paying the pirates, they vanished. No ships arrived. Spartacus was trapped. Crassus, meanwhile, began constructing one of the most impressive siege works in Roman history, a fortified wall and trench across the Isthmus of Rhegium, nearly 60 kilometers 37 miles long. Its purpose was clear: trap Spartacus and starve him out. The rebels harassed the construction, but the Romans held their lines. Eventually, Spartacus, low on supplies and desperate, attempted to break through the fortifications. In a brutal assault, 6,000 of his men were killed. The line held. Then, fate gave Spartacus another chance. A blinding snowstorm swept across the camp, reducing visibility. Spartacus launched a daring breakout through a concentrated section of the line. His remaining 50,000 men escaped once more. Rome held its breath. Spartacus was free again and moving toward Brundisium, possibly to seize ships and finally escape Italy. But now the Senate acted with all its remaining power. Fearing Spartacus might yet reach Rome or stir another uprising, they summoned their two most powerful commanders, Pompey the Great, returning from Hispania, and Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus, governor of Macedonia. Both were ordered to converge on Spartacus. The net was closing, the beginning of the end. Crassus, now determined not to lose his prize to Pompey or Lucullus, pursued Spartacus with everything he had. Along the way, Gannicus and Castus, two prominent rebel leaders, broke off with 20,000 men. Crassus saw his opportunity. He deployed two legions behind their camp, hoping to surround them. Lucullus spotted the maneuver and alerted the rebels, who attacked the hidden force. A bloody battle broke out. The Romans fought hard, trying to buy time for Crassus's main army to arrive. When it did, the trap was sprung. Gannicus and Castus were now surrounded. Their men fought with desperate fury, but were slaughtered, 12,000 dead. With this force destroyed, Crassus could now focus solely on Spartacus. The final confrontation was near. Spartacus's army, still moving toward Brundisium, began suffering attrition. Small Roman cavalry units picked off stragglers. Skirmishes erupted along the way, but the biggest blow came with the news: Lucullus had landed nearby with fresh reinforcements. Spartacus was cornered. In desperation, he attempted to negotiate with Crassus. The Roman refused. With no way forward and no allies, Spartacus turned north back through Campania, hoping for a miracle. But Pompey's army was marching south. Soon, three massive Roman armies were converging on him. For Spartacus and his men, there was no escape. They marched back into Lucania, choosing to make their final stand at the Salaris River. The last stand. It was now 71 BC. After 3 years of fighting, raiding, retreating, and rallying, Spartacus and his rebels would face the full might of Rome one final time. They had no illusions. Before the battle, Spartacus killed his own horse, declaring that if he won, he would have plenty to ride. If he lost, he wouldn't need one. It was a powerful statement of resolve. There would be no retreat, only death or freedom. Crassus's forces numbered around 40,000, including cavalry. Spartacus's men, though exhausted and depleted, still numbered approximately 50,000. But they were outmatched in every way, in discipline, equipment, and formation. Still, they fought like lions. The battle raged for hours. Spartacus charged the Roman lines personally, cutting down to centurions in a desperate attempt to reach Crassus. He was wounded multiple times, but refused to fall. Eventually, surrounded and alone, Spartacus was cut down. With their leader dead, the rebel army collapsed. The battle turned into a massacre, 36,000 rebels slain. Only 1,000 Romans died. The rest of the rebel survivors were hunted, captured, or executed. Crassus lined the Appian Way from Rome to Capua with 6,000 crucified rebels, a grin and public warning to anyone who dared dream of rebellion. Legacy and power struggles. The war was over. Rome had crushed the uprising, but the political games had just begun. As Crassus mopped up the remnants, Pompey arrived, claiming he had defeated the final stragglers and therefore deserved credit for ending the war. Crassus was enraged, but both men now had immense popularity and armies near Rome. To avoid civil unrest, the Senate had little choice but to elect both Crassus and Pompey as consuls in 70 BC. But the resentment between them never faded. Eventually, this rivalry would birth the first triumvirate: Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, an alliance that would, ironically, hasten the downfall of the Republic Spartacus had tried to challenge. The man becomes a myth when Spartacus fell on the battlefield by the Salaris River, sword in hand. Surrounded by the bodies of his comrades, the man died, but the legend was just beginning. Though no one recovered his body from the carnage, his name survived. In a Rome that prided itself on law and order, on power and hierarchy, Spartacus stood as a haunting counterpoint. A man of no status who defied the might of the Republic not once, but again and again for 3 years. And not as a king or consul, but as a slave. It's difficult to overstate the psychological wound Spartacus inflicted on the Roman psyche. This was a society built upon slavery. The wealth of Rome, the power of its elites, the luxury of its villas, and the very structure of its economy all depended on the labor of the enslaved. That such a man, once shackled and brutalized in the arena, could rise and pose a legitimate threat to the eternal city was, to many senators, nothing short of heresy. And yet it happened. He defeated consuls, outmaneuvered praetors, destroyed legions. His rebellion was no mere flare-up of discontent. It was a war. And it revealed just how fragile the Republic's internal structure could be. Political ripples and the first triumvirate. In the wake of the rebellion, political power shifted. Crassus and Pompey, newly made consuls, found themselves locked in a rivalry stoked by Spartacus's defeat. Crassus, furious at Pompey for stealing some of the glory, pushed harder into politics. Pompey, buoyed by public adoration, returned to Rome as the darling of the plebeians. The Senate, weakened and divided, no longer held the balance of power it once enjoyed. The popularity of generals now rivaled the authority of the state. The lesson learned from Spartacus was twofold: that the Republic could be shaken from within, and that military might could elevate a man into near mythical stature. Spartacus's rebellion revealed the contradictions of Rome's structure. It was a republic that claimed to be governed by reason and tradition, but in truth, it was vulnerable to ambition and unrest. That same tension would later help catalyze the rise of Julius Caesar, who together with Crassus and Pompey would form the first triumvirate, a coalition that ultimately dismantled the old republic. Ironically, then, Spartacus, a man who never sought to rule Rome, indirectly helped bring down the system that ruled him. The rebel's legacy in Roman memory. Official Roman history attempted to bury Spartacus under silence. He wasn't glorified in marble like Pompey, nor honored with a military triumph like Crassus. He was a scar best forgotten. But the people remembered. In the taverns and markets, in whispered tales passed down generations, Spartacus became something else. The righteous rebel, the slave who refused his chains, the leader who shared spoils equally and fought alongside his men rather than command from the rear. There is something deeply human in his image, not divine, not born of nobility, but raw, real, defiant. And it terrified the elite. The crucified corpses along the Appian Way, left hanging for months, were meant as a lesson, that they became a monument to fear, not fear of slaves, but of the ideas Spartacus symbolized: resistance, equality, dignity. Historical echoes. Spartacus as a revolutionary symbol. Centuries passed. The Republic fell. The empire rose and collapsed. The memory of Spartacus faded, only to be reborn in a very different world. In the 18th and 19th centuries, with the rise of revolutionary ideals across Europe and the Americas, Spartacus became a political symbol. The French revolutionaries saw him as the embodiment of liberty, rising against tyranny. In Haiti, Toussaint Louverture, leader of the first successful slave revolt in the New World, was called the Black Spartacus. In Germany, philosopher Karl Marx declared Spartacus the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history. The Spartacist League, a revolutionary Marxist group in early 20th century Germany, took his name as a badge of honor. For workers, peasants, and all who felt crushed by empires and elites, Spartacus became the eternal rebel, a martyr not for a single cause, but for the universal fight against oppression. The power of popular culture. In 1960, American filmmaker Stanley Kubrick brought Spartacus back to life for a new generation in the now iconic film starring Kirk Douglas. Though heavily fictionalized, The film captured the moral gravity of Spartacus's struggle, the moment when every man in the crowd rises and shouts, "I am Spartacus," became a cultural touchstone, a cry of solidarity against unjust power. That one scene, despite its romanticism, distilled the heart of Spartacus's legacy. That rebellion is not just an act of violence, but of identity, of unity. The film resonated not only as a historical epic, but as an allegory. Released during the height of the Cold War and the American Civil Rights Movement, it became a quiet rallying call for those who believed in freedom over control and people over empire. Was Spartacus a revolutionary or a survivor? Modern scholars debate Spartacus's true intentions. Was he a proto-revolutionary, seeking to dismantle the Roman slave system, or simply a man trying to survive and escape, who was forced by circumstance to become a general? There is no surviving speech from Spartacus, no memoir, no written agenda. The sources we have Appian, Plutarch, Sallust were Roman, and likely biased. But even through that fog, Spartacus emerges not just as a leader, but as a man of principle. He distributed plunder equally. He resisted dividing his forces until absolutely necessary. He trained his men, gave them purpose, and punished cruelty within his ranks. He showed strategic brilliance, but also mercy, sparing cities that did not resist him. He turned thousands of broken men from different lands, languages, and backgrounds into a fighting force that nearly broke the world's greatest republic. That kind of leadership does not come from desperation alone. It comes from vision. And perhaps that is the most remarkable legacy of Spartacus. Not that he fought Rome, but that he showed what leadership can look like when it is earned, not inherited, when it is shared, not seized. Whispers in the ruins. Today, as travelers walk the ruins of Capua, the former gladiator school long since turned to dust, they rarely realize they are standing on a battlefield not of stone and steel, but of memory. No monument stands for Spartacus in Rome. No statue graces the forum. But in every struggle for justice, in every voice raised against injustice, his spirit lingers. His name has become shorthand for defiance. He was not the first to rebel, nor the last, but he was, and remains, the most unforgettable. A spirit carved in stone and flame. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the man once known as Spartacus faded from the scrolls of official Roman history. But while governments sought to bury his legacy, people kept it alive not with statues, but in whispers, symbols, and revolutions. Unlike Caesar, Augustus, or Trajan, Spartacus left behind no marble triumphal arches. But his legacy did not need stone. It needed only memory. And memory, when passed from voice to voice, can become more enduring than any monument. By the early medieval period, the story of Spartacus was nearly forgotten. Europe had plunged into feudalism. The concept of organized slave rebellion was almost unthinkable. But as the Renaissance dawned and humanist scholars turned their attention back to classical texts, the name Spartacus re-emerged as something more than a gladiator. He was not just a figure of antiquity, he became a metaphor. Rebirth in the Age of Enlightenment. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Western Europe underwent a philosophical transformation. Writers and thinkers began questioning monarchy, divine right, and institutional inequality. The works of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu sought to challenge inherited power and advocate for individual liberty. In this intellectual storm, Spartacus was rediscovered not as a rebel to be feared, but as a hero to be honored. The Enlightenment saw him not as a criminal, but as a man who had the courage to say no to injustice. French revolutionaries spoke his name in salons and pamphlets. Artists painted him with torches raised high, leading men to freedom. The Jacobin admired his egalitarian ideals, his belief in shared struggle, shared reward. To them, Spartacus was not a Thracian gladiator, but the first true citizen of liberty. From Haiti to Hollywood, a global icon of rebellion. Nowhere was Spartacus's spirit more evident than in the Haitian Revolution 1791 to 1804. Led by formerly enslaved men like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the Haitians overthrew one of the most brutal slave systems in the New World and created the first Black Republic. European observers were stunned. How could former slaves, beaten and bound just a decade earlier, forge a nation? To many of the revolutionaries, the answer was clear. Spartacus showed them it could be done. Centuries later, his influence reached beyond politics and into popular culture. In 1960, Stanley Kubrick's film Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas, reintroduced the rebel to the modern world. The iconic "I am Spartacus" scene became a powerful allegory of solidarity where men, threatened by tyranny, refused to betray one another. This moment, crafted on a Hollywood set during the height of McCarthyism, was no accident. The screenwriter, Dalton Trumbo, had been blacklisted by the U.S. government for alleged communist sympathies. Spartacus, once again, became a voice for the voiceless. And that's what makes his legacy so powerful. Each age reinvents Spartacus to suit its needs. To communists, he was a proto-Marxist. To anarchists, a symbol of defiant autonomy. To civil rights activists, proof that oppression could be broken. To pacifists, a tragic reminder of the human cost of resistance. Academic reappraisal. From legend to leadership case study. In recent decades, Spartacus has even entered military and leadership studies not just as a rebel, but as a model of unconventional strategy and inspirational command. Think about it. Here was a man with no formal military training, leading a force of slaves, refugees, and outcasts against one of the most sophisticated armies in history. And not just surviving but winning, repeatedly. Modern historians and military theorists have drawn lessons from his methods. Adaptability. Spartacus never fought the same way twice. Resourcefulness. He turned kitchen knives into weapons and vines into escape ropes. Charisma. His men followed him not from fear, but from faith. Many scholars believe Spartacus's greatest strength wasn't his tactics, it was his ability to inspire hope in the hopeless. And hope, as history has shown, can be more dangerous to empires than any sword. Legacy in today's world. In a modern era where injustice still thrives in new forms, systemic inequality, human trafficking, authoritarianism, the name Spartacus continues to carry weight. Protests across the world have invoked him. In Poland, anti-communist dissidents compared themselves to Spartacus. In South Africa, during the apartheid struggle, murals bore his likeness. In Latin America, guerrilla fighters cited him in their manifestos. Even in modern literature, music, and theater, Spartacus appears as both fire and shadow. He belongs to no nation, no ideology. He belongs to those who refuse to kneel. The eternal torch. So how should we remember Spartacus? Not as a king, not as a warlord, and not just as a slave, but as a man who stood before an empire and said, "No more." He could have escaped. He could have fled. But again and again, he chose to fight not for a crown or conquest, but for dignity, for freedom. And when the time came, he died not hidden in the shadows, but with sword drawn, riding straight into the heart of his enemy. That moment, that charge into the Roman lines, is why he is remembered. It's why he still matters. Because while tyrants build walls, Spartacus builds bridges. While empires conquer with fear, he conquers with courage. And while history forgets many kings, it remembers those who dared to defy them. In every generation, in every oppressed heart, Spartacus lives again. And perhaps that is the true measure of immortality, not to live forever, but to forever inspire those who live.